Welcome, everybody. I think we're about to start the program. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and I also really want to thank our co-sponsors of this event, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and Keith Carney in particular, and also the Northern Ireland Bureau. Norm Houston and Richard Cushney have been very supportive of this event, and are, as I say, co-sponsor along with AOH and the Irish American Unity Conference. So thank you again for working on this and bringing it all together. I want to introduce our panelists tonight. First, we have, of course, Jude Collins. Jude is he doesn't want me to call him a journalist, but I don't know what other word to use for him, from the north of Ireland. He's from County Tyrone, actually. And Jude studied at University College Dublin and also at the University of Manitoba in Canada and the University of Newcastle in England. He has been a lecturer at Ulster University for a number of years, and he has also published a couple of novels and written many reviews. And he is a regular columnist for the Andersonstown News. I always get that name mixed up. It's a tongue twister for me for whatever reason. And a political commentator on BBC Radio Ulster. He writes a daily blog at www.judecollins.org.com, right?
.com.
All right, all right. Our other panelist is former Congressman James Walsh. Jim is a government affairs counselor with the international law firm K&L Gates. Jim is from upstate New York, and he represented Syracuse and the environs in Congress for a number of years, where he rose to become deputy whip of the majority party, the Republican Party. He has been a great supporter of Irish causes, both while in Congress and afterwards. He was the principal sponsor of the Walsh visas, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And we're very fortunate to have Jim with us here today. The political blood runs in Jim's family. As he and I have joked about many times, his dad was actually the mayor of Syracuse when Sharon and I attended the university there, and his son is now the mayor of Syracuse. So Jim himself kind of hopped over that particular position.
I never rose that high.
And your dad was a very popular mayor, too, I might add, by the way, seriously. Our panel will be moderated by veteran Irish Times journalist Suzanne Lynch. Suzanne has now been in Washington for about a year and a half, I believe. She replaced Simon Carswell, who was a great journalist himself and a good friend of many of us who work in the Irish causes. Suzanne was previously the Irish Times correspondent in Brussels, so she has quite a knowledge of what's going on over on the continent. And before that, she was a financial journalist for the Irish Times, again, in Dublin. She has held positions as an arts journalist in Ireland and also the UK for a number of years. She took her doctorate degree from Cambridge University. So welcome, Jude, Suzanne, and Jim. Thank you very much for coming tonight, and we're looking forward to a great discussion. The way we're going to proceed here is we've asked Jude to talk about his book, Martin McGuinness, The Man I Knew, for a while, and then after that, he and Jim, the congressman, will engage in some just a healthy little discussion about what went into the book and what their recollections are of Martin and whatever other subjects they may want to touch on. Suzanne will moderate that, and then after that we'll open the floor for Q&A from people.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Okay, you're all very welcome here this evening. Thank you for coming. It wouldn't be the same without you. I can see looking at you that you're probably a bunch of city slickers. So this little story that I'm going to start off with will probably go over your heads completely, but I'll judge that when I've said it. There was this young man who had just graduated from teacher training college in Belfast in the 1950s. And he got his first teaching post in North Antrim, a rural part of North Antrim, in elementary school. You'd call it elementary, we call it primary. And he thought he would the first day use some visual aids. So when the children came in, he said, "Good morning, children," and he had up on the board a picture of a sheep. So he said, "Now, children, who can tell me what's on this picture?" These are all rural kids, not a sound. So he thought, I mustn't have explained what I said. "Children, what I'm saying is, I have here a picture of something, and I'm asking you to tell me what it is that you see." No response. He said, "Am I landed with the dumbest group of children in all of Antrim, all of the world, Mary?" So he was almost on the point of despair and about to try to explain it again, when suddenly one little hand went up at the back, and the kid said, "Sir, is she a Leicester Blue?" You're not all city slickers. So the moral of that story is, never, if you're going to talk about something, never assume that your audience don't know more than you do. In connection with that, a nice link is that Gerry Adams, about 3 weeks after this book was issued, sent a tweet out, and Gerry is famous for his tweets, but this was a straight tweet. And I read it very quickly because, like all writers, I'm a bottomless pit of vanity and insecurity. So I went straight to it and I read it. And here it is. You tell me if he's complimenting me or not complimenting me, complimenting the other people in the book or not complimenting them. He says, "An interesting collection of interviews by Jude Collins with a range of people about Martin McGuinness. A book worth reading about, a great Irish patriot. Some of the content reveals more about the interviewees than it does about the man they thought they knew." I think what he's emphasizing is that he believed, and with some justification, that he knew Martin probably better than anybody else. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. He knew more of him, but he mightn't have known the particular Martin McGuinness that different people knew. When doing these interviews for the book, 26 in all, I think, again and again, there were things in common that everyone had, but each person had their own perspective. And I think that's what Martin McGuinness was. He was a man of many facets. One of the things that struck me when reading the book after we'd published it was that every interviewee generally, well, just about every interviewee said he was a man of great charm. Nearly all of them mentioned this, how charming he was, how he could approach you in a very human and warm fashion. And I must say my own experience was exactly that. When I was working in the University of Ulster, I met him for the first time. I was doing some research into integrated education, and this involved interviewing people who were notable and had some knowledge of the subject or some views on the subject, and doing a videotape of the interview with them. So I got a cameraman and a sound man from the technical staff at the university. We got into a car and we drove up to Stormont. Before we drove, the man who's operating the camera said, "This is good. I'm looking forward to meeting Martin McGuinness. He's the Minister for Education now. I've never met him. I heard so much about him." The man who was doing the sound, who was from a strongly unionist background, said, "Well, I'm going to go up here and I'm going to do my job, but I'm not going to shake hands with that man." So we went up, we sat in a room, sat for a few minutes, and then Martin came in, shook hands with me, and said, "How are you? I'm really good to meet you at last." I began to think I'm important. He then spoke to the cameraman, and the cameraman said, "Oh, how are you, Martin? It's very good to meet you," and so on. And then he came to the audio man, a sound man, who was from a strongly unionist background, and he said, "How are you? I'm Martin McGuinness." There was a moment's pause, and the guy said, "Oh, how are you, Martin?" It was like a contest between a chocolate soldier and a flamethrower. He simply melted in the face of the charm that was coming at him. And many of the interviewees mentioned this, as I say, and you only have to look at the record. For example, he not only charmed people like myself or the two people who went with me to do the interview, he charmed, astonishingly, Ian Paisley. Ian Paisley, who would have had nothing in common with him. all his career, both of whom would have had very strong views in the other direction. But he charmed me and Paisley, and they became actual friends, genuine friends. I know this because one of the people I interviewed was Ian Paisley's wife, Eileen Paisley, and she too was charmed by Martin McGuinness. All of the family of Ian and Eileen were charmed by McGuinness. He even charmed the Queen of England. If you look at the interchanges between them, there's one of the meetings he has with her, he comes in and he says, he shakes hands and says, how are you keeping? And she says, well, I'm still alive. And he's saying, that's about. There was a kind of a bond there almost. So he was a man of astonishingly strong charm, even for people who had very strongly opposed views to him. He had many other qualities, of course. He had a mischievous streak. For example, there is a man called Sammy Wilson. You may have heard of him. He's a major figure in the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party. And Sammy was unfortunate enough to be a victim of a paparazzo when he was in the south of France in his back garden in the summer. The guy leaned over some fence, I presume, and took a picture of Sammy wearing nothing more than what he wore when he was born. It's a shot from behind in every sense of the word. You can tell it's Sammy, but you can't, you don't see anything else but what you're seeing. And at the first meeting of the Assembly, Martin McGuinness said, I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm particularly pleased to see Sammy Wilson. Sammy, I almost didn't recognize you with your clothes on. That kind of mischievous line. And it wasn't just his political opponents that he put to the sword. One of the people, I think it was Peter King, made this point in his interview, that when Martin was being shown, along with Jerry Adams, a tunnel project somewhere in New York City, I think. And Martin said, well, I certainly hope the outcome of this tunnel is more successful than the tunnel that Jerry tried to dig to get out of Lancash, because it collapsed on him. So everybody suffered that kind of mischievous quality. Reading, again, some of the things people said, I suppose a word you'd use of him was authority. He was charming, he was warm, and that was a genuine thing. It wasn't a false something he put on. He was interested in people and liked people. But when he entered a room, he had that kind of charisma where it was like a magnet which drew all attention. And one of the people I interviewed was a man called Pat McArt, who was the editor of the Derry Journal during the 1980s. And he said some Republicans would be down at the office of a Thursday evening, because the thing went to press that evening, and they'd be waiting for Martin. And when Martin came in, it wasn't that Martin pulled the swaggering chieftain. He simply came in quietly, and automatically you would know who was in charge there. That air of quiet authority. One of the people I interviewed was Mary Lou MacDonald, who's the president of Sinn Féin. And she talked to me about working with Martin, and how if you did something wrong or you made some mistake, he didn't bawl you out. He just gave you, as she said, the look. And having once got the look, she said, you never wanted to get that look again. So again, he led by example. If people were making mistakes, he was working so hard. He made no mistakes, or tried not to make any mistakes. So he was a leader in that sense, and one who exuded a degree of authority. A quality that was given to him by, many people mentioned this, surprising quality, because I've said he was very warm, friendly, charming. At the same time, he was shy. There was a shy quality to him. And the person who mentions that in the book in particular is Baroness Eileen Paisley. She said, I always felt there was a shyness to Martin. And there is. Actually, I have a photograph. He was at a book launch of mine, and I'm signing the book for him. And, he's standing there almost shyly, as if I'm the one doing him an honor by signing the book. So he had that shyness. One of the people I talked to was Aidan McAteer, who if any of you know Irish, Northern Ireland politics, will know that McAteer is quite a resonant name. Eddie McAteer, during the 50s and 60s, up to the late 60s, was the leader of the Nationalist Party, representing nationalists in the 6 counties. And this is a nephew of Aidan McAteer is a nephew of Eddie McAteer. He's also the son of Hugh McAteer, who would have been Eddie's brother, and Hugh was one of the leaders of the IRA during the 40s and 50s campaign, a border campaign which was totally abortive and useless. But he was famous for having, among other things, managed to escape from Crumlin Road jail. But anyway, that's a long way around saying Aidan McAteer was one of the people that I spoke to. And Aidan said, I said to him, I believe you worked for Martin McGuinness for quite a few years. And he looked at me and says, I didn't work for Martin McGuinness. I worked with Martin McGuinness. So he was making it clear that I wasn't talking to some sort of underling. But Aidan said that he travelled all over the world with Martin after the peace process, after the establishment of Stormont. And when they went to somewhere like South Africa or Sri Lanka or wherever, talking about the way that they had come to a peace settlement, Martin would give of himself throughout that entirely. He would be there all day, he'd be talking to people, he would attend the evening meal, he was warm, he was friendly. And then when that was done, when other people would retire to the bar or whatever, Martin would go up to his room and he would watch sport on television, or he'd bring his wife Bernie back in the Bogside, or he'd read a book. There was that quality that he needed to be by himself, because in some ways there was a shy sort of centre to him. So he was a man of many mixed qualities. And I must say, when I heard that I found it quite attractive, and it echoed what I felt myself, that there was a sort of solitary quality to him, which makes his death all the more poignant. He also was, of course, a very courageous man. He wouldn't have been a prominent member of the IRA if he wasn't courageous. Mary Lou MacDonald, in her interview, talks about when he was running for Irish president, which he didn't succeed, obviously, at one meeting in the Mansion House in Dublin, he spoke of how he first joined the IRA. And he spoke of how he had been deeply affected by the death of a friend of his who had been shot by the British Army. And he spoke about how he was faced with the choice, would he join the IRA or would he not? And he said he was afraid. He was afraid to join because he knew what could happen to him. And at the same time, he said he felt ashamed if he hadn't. So it was that kind of human struggle and that honesty of doing something that is frightening and even terrifying, but he believed that that was what he had to do, and he engaged in paramilitary violence. But I've never seen that side of how he got involved in paramilitary action before, and I thought that added a certain quality of courage to him. Of course, when he was a politician, he was also a very courageous politician, politically speaking. There was an occasion in the 90s when, in my own hometown of Omagh, a young PSNI officer, Police Service of Northern Ireland officer called Ronan Kerr, wasn't that right, wasn't it? That was his name, young Catholic.
Oh, yeah.
Young Catholic police officer was shot. When he wasn't shot, his car was exploded and he was killed. And Martin came out with Peter Robinson and with the Chief Constable of the PSNI and called the people who'd done that traitors to Ireland, which surprised, took a lot of people aback, because they were dissidents, they were doing what he believed was treachery, that there was a way forward, a peaceful way forward, and they were choosing to do this kind of thing still. So he, as I say, he had a literal courage and he had a political courage as well. I think I'm open to correction on this, but I suspect that besides the admiration he had from practically all of the Republican community, and from a great swathes of nationalist community, that would be to say people who might have voted SDLP during those years, they would have admired him. But I believe that there was a section of unionist people and even unionist politicians who had a sneaking regard for him. They weren't going to fall into his arms, but they respected him because of the kind of gritty integrity that he showed in his job as Deputy First Minister, and the fact that he made so many efforts towards reconciliation, not all of which were returned, but where he, for example, he offered during, was it the World Cup or the European Cup, Soccer Cup, that he and Arlene Foster should attend a Northern Ireland game, a Northern Ireland team was playing, and a Republic of Ireland game when they were playing, and that didn't happen. But he was the one that initiated it and wanted it to happen. He was the one who made the stretch and met the Queen. People say, of course, that the Queen had to make a stretch to meet him. True. But he didn't have to do that, but he felt that was the thing to do, to show that he respected the people that were important to Unionists, and not the people, simply the people that were important to Republicans. So I think there were, and I suspect there still is, some people who regret the passing of Martin McGuinness, who would have been his political opponents, and even would have disassociated themselves with a great deal of his life, because of the, as I say, that kind of integrity. Some people talk about Martin, and Ian Paisley was one of those, and most people in the press, I think, you can correct me on this one, Suzanne, you want to, they talked about there were two Martin McGuinnesses. There was the bad Martin McGuinness during the years of the Troubles when he was in the IRA and a leader in that campaign, and there was a good Martin McGuinness in the latter part when he committed himself to the political path and worked so hard at affecting reconciliation. Certainly Eileen Paisley believed that, and she put it down pretty much to the influence of her husband. Now you may agree with that or not, I don't, but I'm quite sure she was sincere in that. And I might also add that she spoke of him quite movingly about how he came to the house when Ian Paisley died, and how he wanted to go in and see him and say a prayer for him, and how the members of the family were very appreciative of that. And she talked about the sadness of hearing about his death, and the various letters of condolence that were sent to him. But she believed there were two Martin McGuinnesses. There was a bad one, and then under good influence, like from her husband Ian, he became a good man. Most Republicans would reject that. Most Republicans would say there's only one Martin McGuinness. The Martin McGuinness who committed himself to paramilitary action believed that was the only thing that he could do honestly. And when he committed himself to it, he committed himself fully. And I remember hearing him say once, I can't remember if it was in a conversation or a speech, where he said, it takes an army to fight an army. So when he committed himself to violence, if you like, or armed action, he committed himself fully. And when he moved to politics and felt that was the best route, he committed himself fully. So he led by example, and that kind of example of total commitment to whatever it was that he espoused, I think myself that was his outstanding characteristic. That unstoppable, nothing would stop him in whatever he decided to do. If he believed it was the right thing to do, he would simply keep on doing it until he died. There are two people in the book who talk about whether or not Martin McGuinness was important as a man who then created certain conditions around him, or whether it was the conditions around him which produced Martin McGuinness. I suppose you could ask the same question about President Trump, couldn't you? Is it that President Trump was created by the circumstances around him, the age that he lives in? Or was it that he somehow exerted an influence and created the atmosphere around him? It's an old question, is it the man or the moment that produces? Both Dennis Bradley, a former priest and a political commentator in Derry, believed that he was a product of the time. And he even says in his interview, he says that Martin McGuinness by accident became a leading figure in Republican circles and in the IRA. He said in the early days of the Troubles, Republicans would meet and there'd be loads of journalists and so on wanting to have an interview. And they'd be gathered together, Republicans in a room somewhere, and they'd all be young guys. They're only young guys, 20, 21, 22. And he says that journalists were there, somebody knocked on the door and the guy went out and he says, well, God, the journalists want somebody to take an interview. Well, I'm not going out, because they knew if they went out, they'd be identified, and they didn't want that. So I'm not going out. Hey, McGuinness, you go out. And they pushed him out. And the rest, as they say, is history. I'm sure he says he heard that, and he would believe that it may well be true. Perhaps not. Eamon McCann, however, as a convinced socialist, and he was a classmate of mine, and he is a leading journalist, or was a leading journalist for years in the north of Ireland. He believes that that Martin was very much a product of Derry. He said the Troubles started in Derry, and so they did. That is to say, the violence against civil rights marchers, almost exactly as it was on the 5th of October, 1968. So what is that, 50 years, is it? 50? So in what date is this? This is the 1st. So in 4 days' time, it'll be exactly 50 years when violence exploded onto the streets, and the marchers, as the cameras, happened to be that RTE, Radio Television, were there with their cameras, and they caught the marchers, peaceful demonstrators, being attacked by the police, by the RUC, and pretty viciously in many cases. So that really sparked the Troubles, which then proceeded for so long. He believed that his career sort of followed that same trajectory. That is, when the Troubles erupted, he then, as a result, became involved in paramilitary violence. When the people of Derry moved to politics, he somehow, as a Derry man, moved to politics. And when the peace settlement was arrived at, again, it was the will of the people of Derry. He felt that Derry people were ahead of even the people of Belfast in moving towards ceasefire, and that Martin McGuinness, in a sense, was the product of that time. Again, it's interesting to discuss or think about which of the two might be most true. I remember him very fondly, I must say, but as I say, like all writers, I'm a bottomless pit of vanity and insecurity. So I remember him for two compliments he paid me. One was when he was giving a speech. I got him to be the guest of honour at a book I wrote, a book of interviews about St. Columb's College, which is, I think, the only school in the world, or maybe, there might be another one somewhere, but it's the only school in the world to have produced two Nobel Prize winners, Seamus Heaney for literature and John Hume for politics or for peace. He was the guest of honour when I put together a book of interviews with people who had left St. Columb's the same time as me. I went there as well in 1960, and we all got together in 2010. And in preparation for that, I interviewed a whole range of my fellow classmates, some old teachers, even who are still alive, and the matron, who was still alive then. And Martin was the guest of honour, and John Hume, they were jointly guests of honour. And John spoke first and said that he was really pleased to be asked to this, and he certainly celebrated St. Columb's College, which had given so much to him, given him a chance in life, and made a great deal of difference to his life and many others' lives, like myself. And he was absolutely right. Martin McGuinness stood up and spoke then. Now, you have to keep in mind that Martin McGuinness was one of the worst students ever. He says himself, he says, I failed every exam you could think of. You mentioned it, I failed it. In Northern Ireland, there still is a division at 11 called colloquially the 11 plus. At 11, there's a test you're given, and if you pass that test, and only a third can pass it because that's the way it is, you go to grammar school where you're among people like yourself who are considered brainy. If you don't pass that test at 11, you go to a secondary school for people who are really not very academic. So Martin, St. Columb's College was a grammar school, of course. So John Hume spoke about it and said the difference made to him. Martin stood up then and said that he agreed with every word, and we were honoured to have John here, and he'd done so much for the North and for Ireland generally, and that he clearly owed a lot to St. Columb's College. And then he said, you know, I've never actually, it was held in the site, incidentally, the book launch was held in the site of the old school. And he stood up and he said, I've never been here before. I've never actually set foot in this building before. I went to the school around the back, the Christian Brothers School for boys who failed the 11 plus. He said, so I never really, although I very nearly entered it once. And he said, that was 1969. And he said, Eamon McCann, the man I mentioned, Eamon McCann, who would have been a few years older than him, sent myself and a couple of other young guys up to the back of the college to break into the science lab and get some nitroglycerine so we could put it in the petrol bombs that he was making. And the place erupted. In the course of that speech, I mentioned all that because in the course of the speech, he talked about me, and he said about stuff that I had written, and he said, of course, he's totally fearless. And again, I said, Martin McGuinness is saying that I am fearless. Mark Twain said, I could live off a good compliment for 2 months. I could live off that one for a lifetime. The other compliment he paid me was, he didn't say anything, it was a visual one. It's a photograph that was taken by somebody in his offices in Stormont when he was Deputy First Minister. And it's taken over his shoulder. He's reading the newspaper and it's taken over his shoulder. And if you look carefully, you can see that the paper he's reading is the Andersonstown News. And if you look even more carefully, as I did, he's reading my column. So that's a picture that I treasure, believe me. I don't know what more I can say except that I was very struck. I was at his funeral, as well as all these interviews. Something that comes through is pride in him. And certainly love. At the funeral, his coffin was brought from his home to the Long Tower Church, and it was like it was being moved on a sea of people. And we were inside the church, and you could hear a lone piper leading the coffin as it was brought to the church. And then the doors opened, and his coffin, draped in the tricolour, was brought in and set before the altar. And there were people weeping. And I still find it quite moving. Hold on a second. I'm beginning to sound like Kavanagh now, aren't I? But he, as I say, as a politician and as a person, he inspired not just loyalty, but I think love as well. And I think that'll be the legacy that he has. I'd like to finish by reading just a little bit from the contribution by Aidan McAteer, who, as I say, worked with him, not for him, for so many years. And he's talking about his reaction to Martin's death. When I interviewed people, 2 people, maybe 3 even, wept openly as they talked about him. So I put this question to Aidan McAteer, and he says, did I weep at his death? Definitely. Because of how much he had given, because he was robbed of those last few years with his family, and because he had been forced to do something that was against his instincts. There was a degree of tragedy in his death, an injustice, I think, which I felt acutely. And then he tells how he heard the news. As soon as I heard he had passed away, I got in the car and I drove to Derry. He was living near Belfast at the time. I thought at first that Martin's family had gone to bed. It was 4:30 a.m. and the lights were out. As it happens, they were up, but I didn't want to knock on the door. My wife was with me and I said, we'll drive out towards Buncrana. We drove as far as Fawn and the beach. The sun was just rising. Day was breaking. We were listening to the radio, and at 5 a.m. Tommy Gorman, who's the RTE reporter for the North, Tommy Gorman had the news of his death for RTE. We were in the car on the beach with darkness starting to recede and daylight coming. They played this amazing lullaby with Sinead O'Connor and the RTE orchestra, Lay Your Head Down. When it finished, they said, we're going to the news. And Tommy Gorman said, Martin McGuinness has passed away. I don't know if the music was a coincidence or not, but it was very hard, very hard. I think, to sum up what I felt about him, was similar to what oddly Arlene Foster said of him. It's the words of Hamlet about his dead father, where he says, he was a man taken for all in all, I shall not look upon his leg again. Thank you.
Lovely personal way to finish that. Fascinating insight there, Jude, from that. I think we'll move now to Congressman Walsh, who's going to talk a bit just about your thoughts on the book and your own memories of this man. So maybe we'll start with that and then we'll go into questions.
Pretty tough act to follow there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Suzanne. If I could, I'd like to recognize Billy Tranghese, who is Chief of Staff for Congressman Richie Neal, who was my opposite number through the whole process, and great guy. And Billy really supports him extremely well. And to Norman, thank you for the many, many years of your service here in the U.S. and to Northern Ireland, and God bless you for it. As I said, and by the way, it's a great book. Buy it, okay?
Only $15.
It really is a great book, especially if you knew Martin at all. If you didn't, it's a great way to meet him and to get to know him. He's a remarkable man by anybody's definition. And what struck me in the book, and I think I read 22 of the 25 or 6. Of course, I read mine first too.
Of course.
But the fact that everybody saw the man the same. President Clinton, down to his local unionist adversary, the leader of Sinn Féin, Mary Lou, certainly Jerry, people who dealt with him in politics and people who dealt with him as neighbors. They all saw really the same man, and the idea that there are two Martin McGuinnesses, either there were 1,000 Martin McGuinnesses or there were one. There wasn't just two. And but I think there's just one. And he, whether he was thrust into this or it was guilt because he felt that his community was being, singled out and they were losing their civil rights, whatever. I just think he had that ability to see clearly what was going on and act on it. And when I first met him, I'd heard of him. Like most everybody else in the book, they would say, "What's he like? What's this guy like? What's Adams and what's McGuinness like?" And I think was it Mary Lou said that he was ordinary, which wasn't any kind of criticism at all. It was just that he was like somebody that you would want to know. He's like somebody from the neighborhood that you grew up with, or that you knew a brother or sister of. But he had this quality about him that made those other people in his group push him toward the microphone and the camera. He just had it. He had that ability to relate, to cut through all the BS, to size you up really quickly. It was innate. It's his genes or what it is, I don't know. But some people have it and some people don't. And it was recognized. It's our gene pool sort of instructs us to see certain people as leaders and certain people as not leaders. And clearly he was a leader. And I think that this idea that there were two, there was the warrior and there was the politician. His goal was always the same. He just used the means that were at hand, but always headed toward the same goal. He was very consistent about that. I feel very fortunate to have gotten to know him. As I mentioned in the book, I am an avid fisherman. If I love one thing more than my wife and politics, it's fishing. And I had a day with him in upstate New York that I will never forget as long as I live. I have some photos on my iPad if you'd like to see them. But what I learned about him that day was something that I love about fishing. When you're in the stream, the water's flowing by, and all you hear is the rush of the water, maybe the wind, There's nothing else in the world that matters other than what's happening at the end of that line. It just blocks out everything. All the stress, all the push and pull, all the worry, all the responsibility kind of goes away. And I think you have to go back to, everybody has that spot where you go to recharge your battery, because you have to. Life is stressful, it's demanding. I think that was, along with his family, that was his place to go, was the river.
And did you get to know him presumably through your work on the Hill,
I
Friend
did.
of Ireland?
Yeah.
I mean, in the American political scene, how would you identify, or how would you describe his political abilities? You know, you guys were there on the Hill, meeting all these different politicians from Northern Ireland. Did he bring something different to the table in how he presented the situation to you guys, or what was your impression of him?
Well, what struck me about Sinn Féin was the focus. They always knew where they wanted to go. They had a goal. They always knew that was, everything sort of pointed to that. And of course, then you had Jerry and you had Martin. I remember the first time I met Jerry, I had written, along with a number of other members of Congress, with Richie Neal, to ask President Clinton to extend the visa.
Yeah.
So Jerry got the visa, but before I met him, we talked on the phone. I said, "Can I ask you a couple of questions?" And he said, "Yeah." And one of the questions I said is, "Are you a communist?" And he said, "No." I said, "How would you describe yourself?" He said, "I would describe myself as a European socialist." I said, "Okay, I can live with that." Martin really never talked about his philosophy. I mean, he didn't strike me as a socialist or a capitalist, or maybe he was. I really don't know. But he was always more focused on the immediate goal and the strategy to get there. And he and Jerry were such a great match pair. They just brought totally different things to the table, and yet they were always in step. They always knew. Another thing that struck me about both of them was they knew exactly how far they could get out front. A lot of people in politics, they don't want to get out front, but they did. But they wouldn't get too far out front. I mean, look at the history of Ireland. When somebody decides that there's a different way to go, you leave a lot of people behind. Historically, they didn't want to leave anyone behind. They wanted to bring them along. And you know, Martin's given credit for the negotiation on decommissioning, which was significant to this whole process. The IRA was never going to surrender. They weren't going to hand over their weapons to the British. So the diplomats created this term that I had never heard before in my life. And the diplomats deserve a lot of credit in all this too. But did anyone ever hear of the term putting weapons beyond use before? I mean, what is that? But that's what they did. Nobody knows how exactly they did it, but there was the art of getting the language right, and then there was the art of negotiating that. And there were so many times when he would come to the United States, and we'd say, when are you going to decommission? And he would say, we're not there yet. We're not there yet. And he always knew exactly how far out they could get before they had to back up. Or not back up. They never really backed up, but they would stop at that point and make things right, and then move again.
Because this is one of the interesting challenges for everyone in Northern Ireland politics was, could you bring your people with you, essentially? And knowing how far you could go. And obviously a lot of people, or some people in the community, I just saw that recent film about Dolores Price, for example, who never went with the movement, really. After the peace process, there would have been a community. Do you feel he brought his people with him when he made that those risks, like?
Absolutely. I feel one of the people interviewed in the book is Jerry Adams himself, and I think it's he that says that they learnt a lot from talking to the ANC in South Africa, and one of the lessons that the ANC told them is the people you've got to convince are your own people. You must convince them that what you're doing is something they can agree to. If you don't, it's pointless.
Yeah.
So he said they learnt that, and always at every stage tried to avoid that terrible thing that we see in the first thing in the agenda when there's a meeting of Republicans in Ireland is number one, the split. So he was going to avoid the
Yeah,
split.
yeah.
And they took great care to do that. They would go back all the time and talk to
Yeah.
every part of Ireland where they're Republicans and tell them what they were planning or what they were doing and get their assent.
Yeah. I'm just touching what you said there, Congressman, which is interesting about them being so focused. But in a way, one of the challenges for Sinn Féin in the North was that they did end up having to govern in this power sharing executive and do kind of, apart from their main political purpose, obviously, about United Ireland, etc. He was Minister for Education. You know, there were all these kind of regular political things that had to be done, and he seemed to go with that and embrace that.
Well, I think it was Dennis Bradley again said that McGuinness was a very good paramilitary leader. Otherwise, that campaign wouldn't have gone on as long as it did. But he also was a very good politician, and he took to. Bradley knew him well, and he said he never would have thought it. But the moment Martin went into politics, he took to it like a duck to water. You know, he was in his element. And anytime you see him engaged in a political discussion, I never saw him ill at ease. You know, whether he's making a pronouncement. Well, there was a couple of times he was during the presidential campaign when there was some ambushes, shall we say. But even then, there was a man jumped out of the woodwork and said his father had been killed. His father was a soldier, I think, in the Irish Free State Army or the Southern Army, and he said, "You killed my father," and Martin McGuinness says, "I didn't kill your father." I said, "You know who killed him?" And he says, I don't know who he killed. You're a liar." And I said, "I'm not a liar." So he was able to respond to the most appalling situations.
Actually, on that, sorry to cut across you, because I'd remembered, and it's so that was 7 years ago, must be, because we're now. So Sinn Féin put up Martin McGuinness to run for President of Ireland, for Republic of Ireland, and we're now actually in a presidential campaign now in Ireland. There's an election later this month, and Sinn Féin now have Leonie Riada as their candidate. But I mean, I'm generalising here, but I was living in Ireland obviously at the time, and Martin McGuinness was the legitimate face of Sinn Féin in the South for a lot of people. He was the person that they felt they could put forward, that if anybody could kind of he was an important person for Sinn Féin in the South to put forward, I think, as Sinn Féin started to kind of, which they've successfully done, increase participation south of the border, political participation. For a lot of people down the South, he was much more acceptable as a candidate than some of the others. But as you say there, he did come across these kind of obviously these issues.
It's a tricky one, because some people would say that he was, you know, when he was nominated by Gerry Adams when the Assembly first came together. They nominated, the different parties nominated people, and Department of Education came around, and Gerry Adams says, "Department of Education, Martin McGuinness," and there was an intake of breath. You know, this terrible thing, this paramilitary, this IRA man, going to be looking after our children. What will he do to them? And the fact of the matter was, he was an excellent. I think he was an excellent. He did the one thing that no other Minister for Education has ever done, and which I believe simple sense of justice would demand. He did all he could to abolish the 11 plus, so that all children would move at the same pace, in the same, or not at the same pace, but in the same schools, and you wouldn't be dividing children by supposed intelligence at the age of 11. It's absolute rubbish. As an educator, it doesn't make sense at all. But McGuinness was the only one who had the courage to do that. Likewise, it was a courageous thing, I think, of Sinn Féin, or you could say foolhardy maybe, to pick McGuinness, the paramilitary man, the IRA man, as their representative or their candidate for the presidency. And certainly many of the other parties in the South, whatever you say about the people of the South, many of the other parties of the South may have that. You know, here is this. And Mary Lou McDonald talks about that. She has a line in it where she says something like, Martin McGuinness coming down, he was seen as an outsider. How dare he come from the north? And she said it was the leafy suburbs of Dublin 4 meets the mean streets of the Bogside. So there was a kind of class thing there as well. And northern politicians have always had a problem trying to break down that prejudice. There is a prejudice. You know, you can't partition a country for 100 years and not, you know, have an effect.
But then, of course, the previous president was Mary McAleese, who was from Northern Ireland. But anyway, that's a
Yeah,
different issue.
Middle class.
Yeah, well, there you go.
There I
Well,
go.
it is interesting, though, you say that anecdote about going back to his own school, and maybe that he did feel, you know, looking at his development when he was a young boy, this sense of maybe grievance, that maybe he was left out. Is that one of the reasons he went the route he did, maybe?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
this what comes out in, and I'm wondering, the quote you gave there from Jerry Adams' tweet was great.
Yeah.
That kind of real criticism. But the chapter on Eileen Paisley, I mean, I went to it straight away saying, what's she going to say? And it's remarkable in so many ways. But one of the things which obviously would not go down well with a lot of people on the Sinn Féin side is that she talks in this kind of, she talks about kind of almost like a process of conversion. She talks in these religious terms. Yeah. And then she said, which I didn't see it kind of coming, that through contact with Ian, it changed his life. But young people got so easily caught up in trouble. There were, and she's talking about generally people, she said, there were people who came from otherwise good working families. They just got caught up by older people who thought that this was just very adventurous. And before they knew it, they were caught up in the troubles. I think that's what happened to an awful lot of people, including Martin. So this is the kind of thing that somebody like Jerry Adams presumably is saying, that, no, he didn't just get led astray. But in other words, I'm wondering, is this what Jerry Adams is thinking of when he's saying, you know, people like Eileen Paisley thinking they know Martin, you know, don't patronise us. You know, she didn't. There's another reason. I'm presuming that's what he'd say.
I imagine, I don't think it would stop with Eileen Paisley either. There'd be quite a few of the other people.
Yeah,
but again,
yeah.
he felt he had a privileged perspective. I think he was wrong in that because he had a very good perspective. But everybody, as Jim has indicated, had a perspective on McGuinness. I don't think he was, he went into armed conflict because he didn't pass the 11 plus.
Yeah.
I think
But that's what she's suggesting, essentially.
Well,
she's saying that, you know, a lot of people get into trouble, and that's, you know. But I just thought it was interesting the way you said that that classing that we mightn't see. That there's another nuance to how.
Well, Martin McGuinness tells a story about how after he left school, he went for a job, and one of the first questions he was asked was, "What school did you go to?" And he said, "You know, Christian Brothers School." That was it.
I know, yeah.
It was over. And somebody said it was the most expensive job rejection in the history of Ireland.
Interesting.
I don't think he had a hang up on that. And I
Okay,
think his motivation would have been much stronger and clearer than that.
Yeah.
I'd like to put my oar in the water for the Christian Brothers because they taught me also. And
Oh, really?
yeah.
Okay.
But I didn't have to pass the 11 plus.
Yeah, you did. So, and it's specifically just a Northern Ireland thing now, isn't it? The rest of Britain. they
It
don't
is,
have
well, in the civilized world.
Yeah. So, what do you think, as well, Congressman, about his relationship with Ian Paisley? I mean, this is one of the most extraordinary parts of his development. And in the book, you know, different people from the unionist side, you know, chip in on this.
I think he did what he had to do. He was going to be a co-leader of the country, and his ability to see the best in everyone was, I think, what gave him the ability to make friends with everyone. Paisley was hated by the other side, always, and he was feared and hated, and Martin made a friend out of him, and it was an example to the people that this is what we have to do to make this work, and he led from the front, as he always did. If I can make friends with Ian Paisley, you can make friends with your next door neighbor.
Yeah.
And he always had the people in mind. He always had the example that he provided himself, leading from the front and knowing where his people were. It's a skill that not everybody has. Certainly, not every politician has. But he just had that human ability to bridge the gap, and he knew he had to do it. But it was easier for him to do it. I mean, one of the real problems now is we need a unionist political leader to stand up at the appropriate time and do what Martin did, which is to say, you're a traitor to the people of Ireland. When something bad happens on that side, Peter Robinson kind of got there a couple of times. Arlene Foster doesn't seem ready to do that.
Yeah, I was going to talk about. I mean, one of the things.
But that's what it has. You have to have It takes two. It takes two to tango, and you have to have both sides to make that work. And they did, because Martin extended the hand and Paisley accepted the hand, and they built on it.
Exactly. I mean, this is one of the obvious issues now, is the lack of, the power sharing is essentially stalled in the north. There's no governance happening. It's easy. Everyone now is looking back fondly at the time of McGuinness with Paisley and also Robinson. I mean, do you think this would have happened under Martin McGuinness? So we're now a year and a half almost without an Assembly Northern Ireland up and running.
Well, I think if you think who brought the government down or the Assembly down, and that was Martin McGuinness. Martin McGuinness said we can't have this any longer. You can't have showing no respect for the Irish Language Act, which was promised in a written agreement, international agreement. A Bill of Rights wasn't given. Legacy cases, allegations of corruption in this renewable heat initiative, which is at present being heard, and which is all sorts of stuff coming out of the cupboard for the DUP. I think there's. I tell you, Suzanne, I think there's a danger that when people talk about or report on the North and political parties, they want to be fair. They want to appear to be fair, at least. So they say, why can't they get together and stop squabbling? Get together, do it. And that almost puts the two sides in equivalence. I don't believe they are in equivalence. I don't believe Martin McGuinness would have brought down the Assembly if he didn't believe there was grave injustices happening, and that there was a certain arrogance, as he said, on the part of Arlene Foster. He said in conversation to me, and I'm sure he said it on many other occasions, he met the Queen on a number of occasions. Not one, he told me, and said in speeches as well, not one unionist politician even said, well done. Not one. Yeah. So there really wasn't, in his view, and in my view as well, enough, if anything, coming back from unionism. And as you say, it takes two to tango. And
so do you think the problem is Arlene Foster and the current leadership?
No, it's not the current leadership. I mean,
she can't bring her people with her either. We're getting back to that issue, that if your own side is split, she is not able to manage that.
Yes, I agree. I actually quite like Arlene, and I mean, any occasions I had to talk to her, she was a very nice woman. But I don't think she's a good leader. I think she's a terrible leader, and she's caused huge. You can see it. I mean, you see Nigel Dodds, who's an MP in Westminster, talking, and you can tell who's in charge. Nigel Dodds, he's the deputy leader. He's really the leader. So Arlene, I think, is in place because they don't want to pull her out because it'll look really bad. Look like Republicans made them do it. But I don't think she's an effective leader. But I'm not sure that any leader would have made that difference, except they would have looked at the causes. Yeah. And the causes were this arrogance that says, no, you're not getting an Irish Language Act. Scotland can have a Scottish Language Act. Wales can have a Welsh Language Act. No, you can't have it. You're part of the UK, but you're not getting it.
Well, you see, I, as a reporter, whenever there's politicians here in Washington, Leo Varadkar, the Taoiseach, Simon Coveney, the Foreign Minister, Karen Bradley, the Northern Ireland Secretary, we all ask the same question. What's happening with the power sharing? What can you... And they all give us the same anodyne answer. Oh, well, it's up to them. They have to come together. They're there to govern. What do you think? Do you think maybe Dublin, do you think London, do you think something has to happen to try and get the two sides back up and running there?
I think so. They made a suggestion was made that they should have someone from outside come in and act as chairperson, an international figure. Well, George Mitchell is the one that springs to mind immediately. And Arlene Foster's response to that was, no, that would be wrong because this is a part of the UK and we couldn't have somebody from outside coming in to act as arbiter. Well, what was George Mitchell?
Exactly, that's the same argument that was made then by some people.
He wasn't from the north of Ireland. Exactly, and it is because of what he brought to it.
And Richard
the peace
Haas,
process.
What do you think about that? There's been a bit of, a lot of conversation here that now is a time that maybe, obviously we still don't have an ambassador to the Republic of Ireland from the Trump administration, that's number one, but that this could be the time for some kind of a US special envoy to Northern Ireland, that it needs that outside help. What do you think about that?
I don't want to get too far afield here, but I met the other night with Secretary of State Bradley, at the British Embassy, and it became very clear to me at that dinner that nothing will happen until Brexit is resolved.
Yeah,
Everything is on hold, and I said, well, you know, there's an old principle in physics that nature abhors a vacuum, and there's a vacuum right now there. And while you may not be able to force the institutions back up, but what are you doing to get people together, talking, planning for when we do actually start to govern again, building relationships? And that's a role the Americans could play. One of the things I saw was whenever they would come over here, and Billy can attest to this, when they would come over here, they would be not so much on guard. They would be more willing to. I mean, the first time some unionist politicians and Sinn Féin politicians talked was here in the United States. They couldn't or wouldn't over there. Somebody saw them, they'd be in trouble. So we could do that, but it would require, I think, that they ask us to do it. And I think the Americans would be more than happy and thrilled to play a role. I think
because the Taoiseach, now that was in March, Leo Varadkar did say kind of on the record, we don't think that's what we need at the moment. But we're now like, that's 6 months ago.
6 months ago.
I mean, how long is this going to go on? People are getting frustrated in Northern Ireland. These are people who are supposed to be governing. On Brexit, though, I mean, this is the other big issue now. What's happened is that the border has become the definitive issue in the entire process of Britain leaving the European Union. Nobody saw that happening necessarily. There's been a lot of talk that this is bringing the prospect of a united Ireland much, much closer. What do you think about that? Do you think?
Well, for a long time, one of the things I used to, as somebody who would believe in a united Ireland, I used to feel that the case being made by Republicans was very weak in that they didn't have a sound economic case for it. They would say things like, well, you've got duplication on both sides of the border, two systems of departments of education and so on, and that would save you money and be better. But it wasn't it didn't convince people, and it certainly didn't convince unionists. Now, I don't know anybody, unionist or nationalist or Republican in Ireland, who doesn't believe that a united economic Ireland is a good idea. And it's testimony is given to that fact by the prospect of a hard border, where there'll have to be levies on goods moving and services and so on. And everybody's terrified of that. So everybody now believes that there's a strong economic case for treating Ireland as one unit. Now, if you look at history, very often economic unity is followed by political unity. And in this case, if you put in a hard border, it's going to disrupt. Let me put it like this. It's 20 years since the Good Friday Agreement. That means any 20-year-old literally was just born. If they put a hard border up, it will be, in my opinion, like the first partition of Ireland. Now, that didn't happen peacefully. There was a civil war fought over that. So the notion that, we'll get by and it won't be too severe, the hard border, it'll be sort of hard. If there's a border, young people who have never had that kind of thing will be outraged, I think, even moderate opinion. Just a final point on that, and Joe Brawley, who's a name you would know. Joe Brawley's a Gaelic footballer, and he's a political commentator, or not a political commentator, but a sports commentator on RTE, and he's from Derry, and his father was a Republican. And he said there was a time after the peace agreement, after Good Friday Agreement, there was a time when the middle class Catholics or nationalists who had benefited from things like the 11 plus, like John Hume, when they would have said, yeah, this is okay, we like it like this. We've got a sort of a national health service, and we've got equality of citizenship, and the old orange state of discrimination and gerrymander, which led to the civil rights movement, that's gone. We'll settle into this, we'll go for this. He said there was that possibility, that's gone now. And he says it's gone because of the arrogance and the refusal to budge from unionist politicians, so that overtures by the likes of McGuinness are met with, well, thanks a lot, and that's it, nothing coming back. So whenever Sinn Féin went to the when the North went to the polls, immediately after McGuinness brought the assembly down, Sinn Féin did better than they'd ever done. Because you're talking about them keeping in step with their constituency. Their constituency was ahead of them there. I know for a fact that there were people who were blogging to me or writing comments, and they were saying things like, "This is ridiculous. Why are we doing this? Why are we getting kicked around? Why are they treating us with contempt?" And when McGuinness pulled the plug and there was an election, everybody turned out.
Yeah.
And I would say that's still the case. I don't know any Republicans or nationalists who would want the assembly to be set up tomorrow as it
same
was.
terms.
No way.
But then that's a serious prospect. And I mean, as you're saying, it's a vacuum. It's not going to continue like that forever. Something will happen. Where do you get back Dublin and London? Are we getting back to that situation where there'll be more? It can't continue. So who's going to? I mean, unless there's you're saying or implying that it has to be on the unionist side more.
Well,
Some kind of something on the Irish Language Act, something on.
Oh, of course, I think they have. And I mean, Sinn Féin in the sense of putting their colours to the mast.
Yes.
The Irish Language Act is a kind of totem pole that they're
Yeah, they
putting,
have to,
the canary in the coal
Yeah.
mine that they're putting forward. And they say, if you're not going to give us an Irish Language Act, what's the point of these other things, even talking about them? So, yes, they'll have to be changed. And if they don't get concession, if they don't get certain rights, then they won't go back in, and they'd be very wise not to go back in, because if they go back in, they will suffer terrible damage as a party.
Okay,
And I don't think
suppose,
that's stupid.
I suppose. Okay, well look, let's open it up to the floor. If any questions, probably small enough that we don't need the mic as such, but and maybe introduce yourself as well when you. Okay.
Okay, one thing I want to mention, if anybody wants to come forward, I heard George Mitchell talk at Goucher College. I live in the Washington, D.C. area, Maryland area, and I went up to Goucher to hear George Mitchell talk. He said he got the best history lesson anyone could ever get free. He started out in the morning, he had both sides talking to each other. 45 minutes in, or an hour into the morning, he heard what my people did to your people, and your people did this to my people. And he said it takes them a long while, take them a long while to get back both sides talking to each other. Okay, they do that for a little while. Next thing you knew, it's what your people did to my people, and my people did to your people. So if anybody wants to step up to the plate, it's a good way to get a history lesson for free.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Okay, anybody else? Yep.
I'm Ed Lynch.
Can you just take the microphone actually?
Sure. I'm Ed Lynch, and I was just going to ask Jim and also Jude. There's been a tremendous progress, I think, in the legal system in the North, and a good example is the current Lord Chief Justice Declan Morgan, and things radically changed, I think. Did Martin McGuinness have any role to play in the ending of the diplock courts and the progress in the legal system?
I'll defer to Jude on that. I'm no expert on that.
Well, I wouldn't say I was an expert on it either. In terms of diplomat courts, I think you have to face the fact that, to the best of my knowledge, diplomat courts still operate against dissident Republicans. I mean, when they are tried, it's not with a jury, and they're imprisoned, and not with a jury verdict. So, what was your question?
I said, did Martin have
Yeah.
any role
Oh, yes,
play
yeah.
Changing,
in what
yeah.
I consider, many people consider, a real transition
Yeah.
in the legal system? Because I'm going back 1991 or so, that was rarely was a Republican found not guilty in a diplock court.
Yeah.
I think it's like a 95% or more.
So you think there's been improvement there in that since then?
Oh, there
do,
has.
do you think? Is
Well,
that-
I do. I think that's absolutely true, and you're right to point out Sir Declan Morgan, another St. Column's man, is the Lord Chief Justice. However, yes, and it's true also that there are an awful lot of young or middle-aged now almost lawyers and barristers within the system who are nationalist or Republican in their background, who would never have been there before. I mentioned Joe Brawley earlier. He's also a barrister, as it happens, and his father was interned as a Republican prisoner. So there's a great change in that sense. I know one woman who would come from a nationalist background who's a barrister, and in fact she teaches in the Institute. And from what she says, it's not totally reformed, she would feel. You know, there are many more nationalists, Republicans, or people from that background who are within the legal system now. My friend Owen Rogers, who brought me here tonight and has been ferrying me around everywhere, is a good friend of Niall Murphy, who was the representative for the families of Loughin Island. You may remember that. Well, if you don't, it's that case where a group of people, well, many people, was it, Owen? Many people was on? Yeah. Well, people sitting watching a football match
Yes.
on television. And they burst in on them and shot 6 of them dead. One of them being an 87-year-old man watching TV. But the man who is the solicitor for them and who has been part of an excellent documentary, incidentally, see it if you can, called No Stone Unturned. Go into your, Google or YouTube or whatever. So there are many young and not so young solicitors, lawyers, etc. within the system. But I think at certain levels there still is a certain tilt towards unionism and a degree of control there. Declan Morgan, I'd be very proud of Declan Morgan in one sense, in that he's in the same school that I went to. But on the other hand, I don't think that having somebody at the top of the tree necessarily means that everybody else from that family has their problem solved, any more than Barack Obama being a president of the United States, while a wonderful thing, didn't solve problems for many of the people from Africa and American backgrounds,
I just think there's a radical change in the atmosphere. The leading lawyers tend to be nationalists. Niall Murphy was here at the Congress here a month or so ago in a forum, and Kevin Winters. There's a lot of them. You say now they're middle-aged, but they are really approaching many issues, not just criminal convictions, dealing with the inquests. And my question, back to my original question, did
Martin McGuinness have anything to do with that change? Yeah.
Involvement in the transition in the legal system?
Well, I think the fact that he opted for the political path, I think the fact that he managed to get unionism to agree to the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, where the kind of things that had happened in the past couldn't happen anymore. You didn't have the kind of blatant discrimination and gerrymander, etc. Produced a state where there was an equality of citizenship. And part of the Good Friday Agreement, incidentally, was that there were 2 human rights bodies established north and south, who are now working very hard in terms of Brexit to try to avoid some of the terrible damage that's going to be done to human rights. So they were behind this whole notion of equality within the law. And Martin, I suppose you could say, was one of the people who helped create the conditions where that could happen. But there is a rising tide in all professions of young people or middle-aged people by now who came from nationalist or Republican background, who have now moved into the middle classes, and who, as I say, Joe Brawley said, they're not happy with the state of Northern Ireland. They would, he would claim that if there was a referendum, a border poll, that he believes that, certainly it would run tight, that there's so many nationalists, Republicans, who still feel discontent.
I mean,
with
that's a debate at the moment about the border poll and
yeah.
whether they would have actually support at this moment or not. Yes?
Oh, I have a question. Now, I understand from your talk about your fantastic book, Mr. Collins, that Martin McGuinness was very interested in certain educational reforms, especially about that test at age 11. Did he ever voice his opinion about the segregated school system that I think many people think is perhaps the root of the problem, the sectarian divide? Did he ever have any opinion?
Yes, he did.
Yeah, just to repeat the question there, just a question about Martin McGuinness. Did he ever actually? Did he have an opinion about the school system and essentially the segregation that still really exists in the school system in Northern Ireland, and that a lot of people feel is still at the root of a lot of the problems there?
Yeah, Martin McGuinness on many occasions, and by his actions also, showed that he was fully supportive of integrated education. He believed it had got real possibilities and that it should be supported, and parents should be encouraged to think about that. And he certainly gave funding to integrated schools wherever the opportunity arose. But you have to remember that the fact that what are called segregated schools, that is Catholic schools and schools of suppose you could call them Protestant schools, but most people in those schools would prefer you to call them state schools, that those are the choice of the parents. You know, parents in the north of Ireland can send their children to an integrated school if enough of them want it, but the great majority don't. They sort of vote with their feet, and they send their children to a state school or they send them to a Catholic school. And one last point I would make is there are dangers in assuming that bringing children together, they'll all be friends for life and that'll be it.
Why is there dangers in that?
Because it isn't true.
Why not?
Well, we have had integrated education in the north of Ireland for some 25, 30 years
Yeah.
now. Have you noticed the debating, an abating of bitterness or, you know,
That's because no one's
sectarianism?
going to them, though. I mean, if they become...
There are quite a number of them. I haven't counted them now,
Yeah.
but there's something like, is it 10% or 8% of the schools are integrated schools? You know, if I was running integrated schools, I would have a researcher at work very quickly following people and seeing how they developed after they left the school. Because there's some people who've graduated from integrated schools for the last, 25 years at least. So how have they gone? What have they done for their communities? What have they done to affect reconciliation? I'll be honest, I mean, most people will tell you, even there is peace now, there is as much bitterness as there ever was.
But that's a very depressing... I mean, that is a very negative thing. I mean, why do you think that is?
Because there are problems.
Yeah.
As I say, there are problems like people simply won't. For example, just to take one example, at the time that the election was called, when McGuinness pulled down the assembly, Arlene Foster was asked, would she grant an Irish Language Act, as had been promised in an international agreement. And she said, no, I won't, because that's the thing with Republicans. You feed them, it's like feeding a crocodile. They come back for more and more and more. And that was the greatest gift they ever gave to Sinn Féin. They had guys running around dressed in crocodile costumes. At his first press conference, I remember it well, but just after the election was called, somebody asked, what do you think of Arlene Foster's comparison to you with crocodiles? And Michelle O'Neill, who's the deputy leader now and replaced Martin McGuinness, said, we don't do negativity. And Jerry Adams says, see you later, alligator.
Yeah, it's quite funny.
And again, that was a gift.
Yeah.
That was a focus for so many people
Yeah.
to say, let's get out there and do something
Yeah,
about
it
this.
does seem that Arlene Foster... Yeah, one more question.
So it's a little bit of a point of clarification regarding integrated schools. So my understanding is if you went to a state school, you learned British history, more or less. If you went to a Catholic school, there would be more of a focus on Irish history. So in integrated schools, was there a combination? Did they actually try to integrate that? And then how would that have been, and that this is where maybe research would have been quite helpful, how would that have been perceived in the families of learning about the history of the other side if they didn't know it?
Okay, I think you have a point. What will I say? The question of, say, history and how it was taught. When I was at school, that's absolutely true what you say. I studied for 5 years in St. Columns and I didn't get a single piece of Irish history. 5 years from the age of 30. Irish history.
Really?
No Irish history. But I did get Irish history because I took it at A level. That
Okay.
is in my last year, and then it was an option. And we learned about Grattan's Parliament in the 90s.
Yeah.
It was wonderful stuff.
Yeah.
But none of it was available then. Now, the curriculum is a common curriculum now and has been for decades. Everybody in all schools studies the same thing. So there isn't, Irish history is a part of that now. So I don't think anybody could complain on those grounds. But one last thing. We talk about the two sides. I really think that's a mistake. That really is a mistake. There's not two sides. There's a government to the south of the north of Ireland, the Republic of Ireland government, who are signatories to the Good Friday Agreement, and there is Britain, who would exercise or claim to exercise jurisdiction in the north of Ireland. So clearly those two players are an important part of the problem. It's not that the people just simply these two warring tribes. I've never subscribed to that. I believe that's a simplistic and misleading notion of what's happening in the north of Ireland. Sectarianism is a part of it, of course, but it's not the central problem. Central problem, in my opinion, is that we have a divided country.
Okay, I think we'll really leave it at that then. Thank you very much for all that very interesting discussion, and I would encourage, I mean, in a very more general note, it's actually as a piece of writing, it's, as you said at the very beginning there, you've 25 amount of perspectives on one person, and it's very interesting. How do you ever know somebody? And, how, the different parts to make up a whole and all that. And it's a very, very interesting exercise, if nothing else, in different impressions of this very, very historic figure in Irish history. So thank you very much. And I think you'll be selling books here at the front. So thanks very much for coming along.
Could I just thank Peter Kissel, and could I thank Owen Rogers, who's ferried me around, and thank the Irish American Unity Conference for sponsoring this, and the Northern Ireland Bureau.
Thank you, and I do want to give a big round of applause to our panelists. But first, I'd like to invite Norman Houston, the director of the Northern Ireland Bureau, to come forward and share a few words with us.
Thank you, Peter. I'm not going to keep people back. We have a reception later, which I want everyone to stay around and enjoy. But could I just make a couple of reflections? First of all, I'd also like to thank the panel. I've heard Jude many times on satellite radio in Washington, and I have been very interested in your opinions. I know Suzanne well, and of course the Congressman has been involved in the peace process from the beginning. I'd also like to recognise Brian Cahalan, who is the political secretary at the Irish Embassy, who's a good friend and colleague. Just a few reflections before we finish. I first met Martin McGuinness in 2000 when he came over here as the Minister for Education in our first flirtation with devolution, and that was at the time when the SDLP and the Ulster Unionist Party, David Trimble and Seamus Mallon, were the first and Deputy First Minister respectively. And one of the things that interests me so much about Martin, who I'd never met before, was that one of his big issues was not just about the 11+, which we've talked about earlier, but it was also about the fact that working class male Protestants were failing miserably at school. Very few of them were staying on to go to university or higher education, and many were leaving school without any qualifications at all. So you had this Republican from Derry who was worried about working class Protestants, mostly in areas like West Belfast, the Shankill. And he had a very great passion about this, and it was one of the reasons he came here to see what the American government was doing to help underprivileged children here from less well-off backgrounds get through the education system. I started working with him again in 2007 when I came here as the director of the Northern Ireland Bureau, and by that stage he was our Deputy First Minister, a post I have to say he held through the entire period of devolution, because as you know we went from May 2007 until January 2017 before the whole thing collapsed. So I was with him in the early days when he came with Dr. Paisley, and as someone who was brought up in the Northern Ireland Protestant tradition, if someone had said to me a number of years ago, Martin McGuinness and Dr. Ian Paisley were going to be very special friends, and Martin McGuinness is going to visit the parsonage in Cypress Avenue and meet Lady Paisley, I'd have said the person was mad, but it worked. And I think there's a number of things I would like to say. I brought them to see George Bush at the White House in the Oval Office in December 2007. And we were very worried here. I was a senior diplomat representing the Northern Ireland government. And I thought, this is just not going to work. These people are going to argue. There's going to be all sorts of fusses. What car do I drive in? What limousine am I in with the First Minister, with the Deputy, blah, blah, blah. And actually, Martin spent a lot of his time making sure that Dr. Paisley found his way to the different meetings. Dr. Paisley, by that stage, was quite elderly, very clever and knew what he was doing, but was very slow on his feet, as they say in Northern Ireland. And Martin would have touched his arm and helped him up the stairs and things like that. So in the very early stages, Martin did a lot of almost in a sort of caring, younger brother, younger cousin way, tried to help the First Minister. And that relationship definitely did work. And I know that the Paisley family were very pleased when Mr. McGuinness came to Dr. Paisley's funeral. And the thing about Martin is, when my own mother died in 2011, Mr. McGuinness and Mr. Robinson came to my mother's funeral. I am Presbyterian. They sat under the Union Jack flag in the church with everyone else. He was just that type of person. And when the memorial service was held on Capitol Hill, which Congressman Neil read the eulogy at, it was absolutely full of members of Congress. So I think all of us in Washington who have worked with Martin over the years knew the sort of man he was and the contribution that he made to the peace process and indeed his outreach to people in the Unionist community. And certainly from my perspective, being the diplomat for Northern Ireland in the United States, it was an absolute pleasure to work with him. I would make one other comment, and I know we want to break up. Integrated education is a very important thing in Northern Ireland, and I think you really really illustrated earlier in your conversation. And Jude is right, only 8% of children in Northern Ireland go to integrated education. There's about 65 schools. There are 65 schools around Northern Ireland. The position of my government before it collapsed wasn't actually directly encourage integrated education, but shared education. And the idea was that the schools would remain segregated, but the children would share certain subjects together. One school would be a magnet school for mathematics, another school would be the magnet school for chemistry, whatever, and the children would then move between schools. In Northern Ireland, the growth of the integrated sector has mostly been bottom up. It's not top down, so it's actually parents coming together and deciding that they want the schools to be integrated. And often this happens in rural areas where the demographics dictate that you can't have a Catholic school and a Protestant school because there's not enough pupils, and it comes around on that way. And I think Jude made a very good point about parental choice, and while I'm not a personal advocate of the 11+ system, what often happens with parents is they want the school that's academically best for their children. If you look at St. Collins and Derry, we only have to look at the people that have gone through it. I mean, and often what a parent is looking for is my kid going to get the education here to go on to university, and I think that's part of the issue as well. We haven't really taken on board the comprehensive system which they have in Great Britain, and just in a few weeks' time Baroness May Blood will be here in town, and I'm hosting an event for her where she's going to talk about integrated education and what it can do to hopefully break down barriers. But I don't want to say anything more. I'm very pleased to be here, pleased to sponsor this evening, and I hope to chat to you as we have some refreshments in another room. But thank you to the panel again, thank you to Peter, and thank you to Keith.
Thank you very much, Norman, and I do want to add that the Northern Ireland Bureau has also taken a very sincere and deep interest in education in the city of Washington. They are big supporters of an initiative called DC Scores, and I would encourage you all to go on and take a look at them. DC Scores helps children in the education field, and Norman has been a big part of supporting that. So thank you for that, Norman. I guess, Keith, we're going to be in the next room. Okay, and with that, I think we're pretty much finished here. But again, I'd like to thank again Jude for coming across the Atlantic to be with us, and Suzanne for your moderating this panel tonight, and Jim for joining in. And just want to give them all a big round of applause. Now, before you go next door, you have to buy Jude's book. So.
Oh, do you? Yeah, well,
This
give it
is
too
your
much
book,
time.
which I'm going to give you back
Well,
now.
I haven't
Are
read
you
it in a
sure?
while, so